Aloha! Welcome to week 3 of Jesus at the Beach, where we continue to talk about Jesus doing stuff at a beach and how it's pretty cool. When I go to the beach, I like to bring stuff so that I can enjoy my time at the beach. So when I go to the beach, I've got to bring sunglasses and a hat, and I've got to bring a chair, and I've got to bring an umbrella, and I want to bring probably a book and some games to play, and lots of different things so that when I'm at the beach, I can stay there all day, and I don't have to go home or back to wherever I'm staying to get more things. But it happens all the time. I get there, we set some things up, and we probably forgot something. Has that ever happened to you? Probably. So in our story today, in our lesson for today, we're going to see that the disciples forgot something. And Jesus used that object to teach them a lesson. And the disciples, well, they didn't get it. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 16, starting with verse 5. And we're going to read this together, then we'll talk about it. It says these words. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "Is it because we didn't bring any bread?" Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you still talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not telling them to be on guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Jesus and his disciples, they traveled together a lot. They went to lots of different places so that Jesus could spread the good news about who God is and who we are and what God's kingdom is all about. Jesus was doing ministry, and his disciples were there to learn from Jesus and to help Jesus carry out some of these teaching. So when they're in the boat, when they're getting ready to cross, they realize they forgot something. And in fact, they forgot something pretty major. They forgot bread. Now, bread was something that was very common and something that was very commonly ate at most meals. So to forget bread was kind of a big deal. So they were probably a little embarrassed about it to begin with. But Jesus used this opportunity to teach them something. And Jesus did that all the time. He used everyday objects to bring about God's truths and to teach people. And so this was not an exception at all. So Jesus said, "Beware of the yeast of the Sadducees and Pharisees." Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were religious groups that were in and around at Jesus' time. They were leaders in the Jewish faith, and they had different views about the afterlife, and so there was a big wedge and division between the two. There were some other differences as well, but they believed some small differences in enough that they broke off. The Pharisees taught one thing, the Sadducees taught another, but they led these groups and added a lot to what God's teaching was. So much so that, as you can see throughout the Old Testament, they added law after law after law. God gave 10, and on top of that, they gave a lot more. In fact, there are over 600 laws in the Old Testament, and the Pharisees and Sadducees had a lot to do with adding to God's law. So when Jesus says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees," this is what he means. You see, God's law, God's truth, is not necessarily all that complicated. But the Pharisees and Sadducees added to that And on top of that, a lot of expectations, a lot of rules, and it was filling up and occupying a lot of people's time so that they could try to follow those laws that they put in place. Now, yeast, what it does, it's an additive that you use in bread to cause it to get big, to rise, to get big and fluffy, okay? So when you bake the bread in the pan, it rises up and it gets, like I said, big and fluffy, and you can eat it. Now, God, when he instituted the Passover meal, he told them specifically that he wanted them to have bread that didn't have yeast in it. So it was a flat bread. And that's the kind of bread that we usually have when we have a communion. It doesn't have any yeast in it. It doesn't have anything extra in it. It doesn't fill up space that it doesn't need to. It's bread, but it's bread that doesn't have that yeast in it. And what he's saying is that these extra laws, these extra things that the Pharisees and the Sadducees added to God's law, they're kind of unnecessary. A lot of what they added were just things that they wanted to add because they wanted to feel important, or they wanted to be in charge, or they wanted to make sure that people followed God in a certain type of way, when God didn't have all of those rules. He made it pretty simple so that people could follow him. So Jesus says, beware, be on guard, be aware that these laws, these teachings, are kind of unnecessary. So for you and for me, we need to trust God and trust in God alone. You and I, we put our faith in a lot of different things. We fill our lives with things that are really unnecessary. If we remove some of the distractions in our lives, if we removed our reliance on other things than God, then we might be able to pursue God and follow God in a greater way. Things that we put our faith and our hope in, things that we look to other than God, honestly, we look at ourselves a lot. You know what? Hey, I think I can fix this. I can fix this on my own. I can do this on my own. And that is part of the yeast, because we need to rely on God to fix some of those things in our lives that we can't fix, like sin, which is a big deal. Another thing that we sometimes put our trust and our faith in are other people. Hey, you know what? That person has got it all together. They've got it all figured out. I'm going to go to them and ask them for advice. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and we'll get to that here in a minute, but they're not God. Here's another one. People put their faith in the things of men, so money and possessions. You know what? Sometimes people think that money solves everything. And God is telling us that that's not the case. Now, those things in and of themselves aren't necessarily a bad thing. God has given us a brain. He does want us to work some things out, but if we leave God out of the equation altogether, that doesn't really help us. And other people can be really wise and can follow God really well, but again, if we just take their word for it and don't consult what God desires of us, it doesn't really help us. And money in and of itself isn't evil. The love of money is. If we rely only on our abundance and our wealth and the possessions that we have to get us through, guess what? If we don't include God, then those things become meaningless and they are going to be empty. They're going to be filler. They're going to be yeast. God desires that you and I follow him as closely as possible. So some of these other things in our lives need to kind of go to the wayside. So this week, what I want you to do is I want you to think about some of the yeast, some of the filling in your life. Are there things that you do that take up your time that you could be spending in a different way? That you could be spent better to honor God or to listen to God or to serve God? And think about what needs to go away so that you can pursue God in a greater way. So that's all for this week. I'll see you next time.